She accepted money to live a lie. She just didn't expect that the greatest truth of her life would be born from that charade. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel. We post every day. Continuing. The London sky dawned gray that April morning, as if reflecting the state of mind of Louisa Campbell. At 32, she once again stared at her bank statement on her phone, sitting at the small kitchen table in her rented apartment in Hackney. The negative numbers seemed to mock her, while her coffee grew cold in the faded cup she had bought at an antique fair when she still believed her theater career would take off. Having graduated in performing arts almost a decade ago from RADA, Louisa lived the paradox of being artistically respected but financially ignored. She taught acting classes at a community arts school in a less affluent part of town, directed experimental plays with minimal budgets, and occasionally landed roles in independent productions that never reached the wider public. Her last hope, an audition for a streaming series, had just been dashed by a generic thank you email for her participation. The apartment, once a place of creativity and dreams, now seemed to suffocate under the bills scattered across the counter: overdue rent, a bank loan with astronomical interest, maxed-out credit cards to pay for her mother's medication back in Cornwall. Louisa ran a hand through her curly hair, which had needed a trim for weeks, and sighed. Her landlady's voice echoed in her mind. "Just one more month of grace, Louisa. After that, I'll need the property back." Her phone ringing interrupted her thoughts. On the screen, Marcus's name, a friend from university, shone like a promise of distraction. He had moved away from theater to work in corporate marketing years ago, and their conversations were now rarer, but always warm. "Lou, I need to see you today. It's urgent, and it might be the solution you're looking for," he said, giving her no time for questions. At that point, any possibility of a solution seemed valid. She agreed to meet him in the late afternoon at a cafe in Mayfair, a neighborhood she rarely frequented due to the prohibitive prices. As she got ready, she found herself thinking she should have washed the floral dress she put on more thoroughly, her costume, to appear successful in front of her friend who had made it. Café Milan was exactly as Louisa imagined: minimalist, with dark wood, baristas in black aprons, and clientele who spoke softly about investments and international travel. She felt out of place, with her handmade fabric bag and unpolished nails. Marcus, on the other hand, fit perfectly into the environment, with his tailored suit and a watch that probably cost more than 6 months of her rent. "Lou, long time no see." He hugged her with genuine affection, and for a moment she remembered the idealistic boy who used to recite Garcia Lorca in the university corridors. "You look beautiful." It was a kind lie she accepted with a tired smile. After the greetings and ordering coffee, which she promised herself she would drink slowly to justify the price, Marcus got straight to the point. "I have a proposal for you, professional, well-paid, but unusual." Louisa raised an eyebrow. In her situation, unusual wasn't necessarily bad. "Remember my boss, Richard Miller, CEO of Miller Developments?" She nodded vaguely. She knew the company from the newspapers, one of London's most traditional construction firms, run by a conservative and influential family. "He's about to close a multi-million-pound contract with an Italian group, the Farrells, extremely traditional, devout Catholics, and obsessed with family values." Marcus paused, as if searching for the right words. "They only negotiate with men they consider stable, married, specifically." "And what does that have to do with me?" Louisa asked, confused. "Richard has been divorced for 3 years. He's never really recovered. He lives for work, no personal life. The Italians have scheduled a week of meetings in Tuscany at the family estate, and they demanded he bring his wife." Louisa felt her stomach sink as she understood. "You want me to pretend to be his wife? That's insane, Marcus." He leaned across the table, lowering his voice even further. For 50,000 pounds, Lou, net, in your account. A week in Tuscany, 5-star accommodation, all expenses paid. You just have to act. The number echoed in Louisa's mind like a bell. 50,000, all her debts paid, with enough left over to breathe. Maybe even a small investment for her community theater project. Why me? You could hire a model, someone. We need someone intelligent, articulate, who can talk about art, literature, who seems real. He paused. And Richard specified he didn't want someone who looked like, a high-class companion, she finished, amused and offended at the same time. Exactly. He wants someone who can appear to be his partner, not a trophy. She took a sip of coffee, buying time to process the absurdity of the proposal. What if I refuse? No problem. We'll find someone else. Marcus smiled, but there was a hint of plea in his eyes. But I thought of you immediately. You're perfect for this, Lou, and I know the money would be useful. The mention of her financial situation should have offended her, but Louisa was too desperate to afford that luxury. For a moment, she thought of her students, what they would say if they knew their teacher, who spoke so much about honesty on stage, was considering a charade for money. I want to talk to him first, she finally said. I need to know what I'm getting into. Marcus smiled, visibly relieved, and picked up his phone. The meeting with Richard Miller was scheduled for the following morning at the construction company's office, an imposing building in Canary Wharf. Louisa barely slept, debating with herself about the morality of the proposal, about her dignity, about what her mother would think. But when the alarm rang, she already knew what her decision would be. Richard's office occupied the top floor of the building, with a panoramic view of the city that seemed tiny below. Louisa felt diminutive as she was led by the impeccably dressed receptionist to the meeting room, where Marcus was waiting for her, accompanied by a tall man with graying temples and a military posture. Miss Campbell. Richard Miller's voice was deep and controlled, without any intonation that revealed what he thought of her. His blue eyes, cold as steel, assessed her with clinical precision. Thank you for considering our unusual proposal. She extended her hand, determined not to be intimidated. I am still only considering, Mr. Miller. I'd like to understand exactly what you expect of me. A slight arch of his eyebrow indicated he wasn't used to being questioned, but he nodded and gestured to a chair. Bluntly, I need you to pretend to be my wife for a week in Italy, to accompany me to dinners, smile for photographs, discuss our marriage with the Farrells. They are traditionalists and value men committed to family. Marital stability for them is a sign of business reliability. That sounds antiquated. It's bizarre, he agreed, to her surprise, but it's 100 million euros in investment. I can afford some concessions to their eccentricities. Louisa noticed he was observing her with curiosity, as if she were a rare specimen. Marcus told me you're an actress. I am, and a drama teacher. Perfect, because this will be a performance. Richard stood up, unbuttoning his jacket in a studied movement, and walked to the window. Against the London sky, his profile seemed carved from stone. I have a contract drafted, with specific clauses, absolute confidentiality, no personal involvement, affection only in public when necessary for the act, immediate termination upon return to the UK. He turned to face her, as if expecting her to be offended or to back out. 50,000 is the proposed amount, half up front, half upon completion, all expenses covered. You need to be available for 10 days, including flights. Louisa took a deep breath, trying not to show how much that amount meant to her. When would it be? 3 weeks from now. We depart on a Wednesday. What if we're not convincing? If they suspect? For the first time, a faint smile appeared on his lips. Then, Miss Campbell, we will have wasted time and money, but I have faith in your artistic abilities." She raised her chin, suddenly annoyed by his condescending tone. "If I'm going to do this, I have conditions too." Marcus, who had been silently observing the conversation until then, exchanged a worried glance with Richard, who merely gestured for her to continue. "I want the contract reviewed by my lawyer. I want to participate in creating our story as a couple. I won't just memorize what you decide. And I want autonomy to refuse any situation that makes me uncomfortable." Richard studied her for a long moment, as if recalculating his initial assessment. "Fair." He extended his hand. "Do we have an agreement, then?" Louisa felt the weight of the decision in her chest. She was about to embark on an elaborate lie for money, something she had always criticized in her lessons on artistic ethics. But she also saw the opportunity to finally breathe, to help her mother, to buy time to rebuild her life. "We have an agreement." Her small hand disappeared into his, large and cold. The next 3 weeks passed in a whirlwind. Louisa signed the contract after minor adjustments suggested by a lawyer friend who was deeply intrigued but accepted her vague explanation of confidential acting work. She received the advance, paid the overdue rent, settled her credit card, and sent money to her mother, who cried with relief on the phone without asking too many questions about her daughter's sudden financial improvement. The meetings with Richard to rehearse the marriage were tense and methodical. He created a detailed document with dates, locations, and events of the fictitious relationship. They met 5 years ago at a charity event for the restoration of the Grand Royal Theatre. They symbolically married, to avoid legal issues, in an intimate ceremony in Brighton 2 years ago. No children, by mutual choice. She kept her artistic surname. Richard was obsessively precise. He even created a playlist of songs that would be theirs, in case anyone asked. Photographs were edited to include her in moments of his life. A commitment ring was chosen, not too ostentatious, to match the image of an independent actress who wasn't dazzled by jewelry. "Do you always wear your hair like that?" he asked in one of the meetings, observing Louisa's voluminous curls. "Yes." "Why?" "Nothing. Just memorizing details." There was something about his methodical coldness that both intrigued and annoyed her. Richard Miller was a man built in layers of control. His office, his home, which she briefly saw for one of the rehearsal sessions, his gestures, everything calculated, contained, with no room for spontaneity. The complete opposite of everything she valued in art and life. On the eve of the trip, they met one last time at her apartment, at Louisa's request. She wanted him to see where she came from, who she really was, to make it easier to build a believable story. Richard seemed out of place in the small space filled with books, theater masks, and plants. He observed everything with contained curiosity, pausing at a photograph of Louisa dressed as Juliet. "You were the lead?" "Yes. My last big role in a traditional theater." "Why did you stop?" The question caught her off guard. No one ever asked directly. "I didn't stop. The market stopped calling me." Something in his gaze changed, a slight softening that lasted only a second before he returned to his usual composure. "Tomorrow, 6 in the morning at the airport," he said, consulting his watch. "Don't be late." "I'm never late for a performance, Mr. Miller." He nodded, almost amused by the provocation. "Until tomorrow, then, wife." When the door closed behind him, Louisa sat on the sofa, caressing the fake ring on her finger. For the first time, she felt the real weight of what she was about to do. It wasn't just an act. It wasn't just a lie for money. It was an entire week living a life that wasn't hers, alongside a man who seemed the embodiment of everything she had always avoided. That night, before sleeping, she made a promise to herself. She wouldn't lose her essence in this charade. She would use this experience as artistic material. She would observe Richard Miller as a character study, and above all, she wouldn't let herself be affected by him, by his world, or by his coldness. What Louisa didn't know was that promises made in the security of a London apartment tend to dissolve quickly under the Tuscan sun, and that some performances, when too convincing, end up becoming truths that no contract can control. The first contact with Tuscany was like a fever dream for Louisa. After almost 12 hours of flying, exhaustion battled against enchantment as the car that picked them up at Florence Airport snaked through cypress-lined roads that seemed straight out of a postcard. Richard had remained practically silent throughout the journey, alternating between working on his laptop and sleeping with the pragmatic efficiency that seemed to define his existence. The Farrells' estate was exactly as in the photos Richard had shown during the preparations. An 18th-century golden stone villa, surrounded by vineyards and olive groves that stretched as far as the eye could see. When the car stopped in the time-polished stone courtyard, Louisa felt a knot in her stomach. The performance was about to begin. "Remember," Richard murmured, holding her hand for the first time since they boarded. "We are in love, but discreet. The Farrells are observant. They notice details." She nodded, automatically adjusting her posture, her smile, the way she leaned slightly towards him. Years of stage training kicked in like an instinct. "I know how to do my job, Richard," she whispered back, squeezing his hand hard enough to make it clear she wasn't intimidated. A couple in their 60s awaited them at the entrance. Joseph Farrell was the patriarch of the business group, a man of medium height, white hair, and intense dark eyes that seemed to evaluate everything around him. His wife, Sophia, had classic Italian elegance, with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her perceptive eyes. "Richard, we finally meet the woman who conquered our workaholic friend," Joseph exclaimed in fluent English with a strong accent. Louisa smiled, allowing Richard to introduce her with an arm around her waist, a gesture that, despite being rehearsed, gave her an unexpected shiver. "Louisa is an actress and drama teacher," Richard explained, with a pride in his voice that sounded surprisingly genuine. "She works with communities in the outer boroughs of London, bringing art to children who have never set foot in a theater." Sophia held Louisa's hands in hers, studying her with interest. "What wonderful work, my dear. It must be gratifying to see the impact you have on these young lives." There was something in the observation that sounded like a test. Louisa realized she would be evaluated not just as a wife, but as a person, as a woman, as a professional. "It's the most meaningful thing I've ever done," she replied sincerely. "I believe art can transform realities." A spark of approval appeared in Sophia's eyes, and Louisa felt she had passed the first test. The couple's assigned rooms were spacious and elegant, with views of the gardens and a king-size bed that immediately created an elephant in the room. Richard had secured a room with 2 beds during preparations, but clearly something had changed. "I'll speak to them," he said, placing his bags on the floor with a sigh. "No," Louisa interrupted him. "That would seem odd. A couple, asking for separate beds? We'll keep up appearances. The bed is big enough." Richard watched her for a moment, then nodded dryly. "You're right, but we will maintain professionalism." "I wouldn't expect anything less, Mr. Miller," she replied, with a hint of irony that he preferred to ignore. Dinner that first night was a lesson in observation for Louisa. The Farrells hosted 2 more couples, executives from the group and their wives, for a 6-course meal accompanied by wines from the estate. The conversation flowed in English, occasionally punctuated by Italian expressions that everyone pretended to understand. Richard, to Louisa's surprise, was more relaxed than she had ever seen him. He smiled more often, casually touched her hand across the table, and at one point even recounted an anecdote about how she had won his heart by mercilessly criticizing his limited knowledge of Molière on the day they met. She told me a man who only knew the miser didn't deserve to comment on French theater, he recounted, provoking laughter at the table. I was so intrigued that I invited her to dinner that same night. Louisa maintained her smile, impressed by his ability to improvise something that sounded so authentic, a skill she hadn't expected in someone so methodical. The real surprise, however, came when Joseph asked how the marriage proposal had happened. They hadn't rehearsed this specific detail. Louisa prepared a safe, generic answer, but Richard spoke first. "It was in Brighton," he began, his eyes meeting hers with a new intensity. "We were walking along the beach at dawn, after a night where Louisa had performed at a theater festival. She was radiant, still made up from the show, barefoot in the sand." Louisa felt something strange in her chest. He created the scene with such vivid details that she could almost see herself there. "I hadn't planned it. I didn't have a ring. I'm not an impulsive man," he continued, his voice slightly lower. "But in that moment, seeing her against the sunrise, I knew I needed to have her in my life permanently. The entire table seemed enchanted. Even Sophia, with her analytical eyes, seemed touched. Louisa realized she needed to react and let genuine emotion color her face, surprise at the storytelling ability of this man who seemed so pragmatic. "He caught me completely off guard," she added, finding the perfect cue. Richard had always been so controlled. To see him vulnerable, kneeling in the sand without caring about his expensive suit. She smiled, gently touching his face. "How could I say no?" At the table, glasses were raised in a toast to the couple. In Richard's eyes, something indefinable gleamed for a second before disappearing behind his usual mask of control. Later, back in the room, silence hung heavy between them as they prepared for bed. Louisa emerged from the bathroom wearing discreet cotton pajamas to find Richard arranging pillows in the middle of the bed, creating an improvised barrier. "An unnecessary precaution," she commented, unable to suppress an ironic smile. "I promise not to attack you during the night, Mr. Miller." He didn't smile back, but something in his eyes softened. "You were convincing today." "You too. I didn't know you had a storyteller inside you. I merely followed protocol, creating a credible narrative with enough emotional details to appear authentic." Louisa shook her head, incredulous at his ability to rationalize even a moment of apparent spontaneity. "Of course, the protocol." She slipped under the Egyptian cotton sheets, turning her back to him. "Good night, husband." The following days established a strange routine. In the mornings, Richard attended meetings with the Farrell Group executives, while Louisa was invited by Sophia for walks through the vineyards, visits to nearby villages, or afternoons of conversation in the fragrant gardens. To her surprise, Louisa discovered in Sophia a complex and fascinating woman, far beyond the image of a traditional Italian wife. She had a degree in art history, spoke 4 languages, and maintained social projects throughout the Tuscany region. In the hours they spent together, Sophia shared stories about the challenges of balancing her own identity with the expectations of Joseph's traditional family. "True love doesn't mean losing yourself in the other," Sophia said one afternoon, as they walked among ancient olive trees. "It means finding someone who sees your worth exactly as you are." Louisa felt a lump in her throat. "How did you know Joseph was that someone?" Sophia's smile was enigmatic. "When I realized he fought against his own traditions to give me space to grow." She paused, observing Louisa carefully. "And you and Richard? How did you know?" The question caught Louisa off guard. She could have recited the fabricated story, but something compelled her to honesty. At least, the greatest honesty possible within the lie. I I'm still discovering who Richard truly is, she replied, choosing her words carefully. He hides behind layers of control, but sometimes I see glimpses of something more. Sophia nodded, as if the answer made perfect sense. Men like Joseph and Richard build fortresses around their hearts. It's our hardest task to decide if it's worth the effort to tear them down. In the evenings, at dinners and social events, the performance of the loving couple became increasingly fluid. Louisa was surprised to realize how easy it was to laugh at Richard's contained jokes, how her body naturally responded when he placed his hand on her waist to guide her through guests, how her eyes instinctively sought him out upon entering a room. Conversely, she also noticed the small changes in him, the way his fingers lingered an extra second in her touch, how he occasionally watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, how his smile, once mechanical, now seemed to reach his eyes when directed at her. On the fourth night, after a particularly pleasant dinner, they returned to their rooms slightly inebriated by the estate's red wine. The pillow barrier had disappeared the night before, when both silently agreed it was an unnecessary exaggeration. Now they slept each on their side, but the tension in the air became more palpable each day. "Are you enjoying Italy?" Richard asked as he loosened his tie, a gesture Louisa had discovered to be the first sign of his relaxation at the end of the day. "It's like a dream," she admitted, removing her earrings in front of the antique mirror. "One that will unfortunately end in a few days." Something darkened in his gaze. "Are you eager to go? Back?" Louisa hesitated, surprised by the question and the note of vulnerability in his voice. "I miss my students, my real work." She turned to face him. "But, no, I'm not eager for this to end." The silence between them vibrated with unspoken possibilities. Richard took a step towards her, then stopped, as if he had hit an invisible barrier. "Louisa." A knock on the door interrupted the moment. It was Sophia, inviting them to a special wine tasting in the estate's historic cellar. In the ancient stone cellar, lit by lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the centuries-old walls, the Farrells offered an intimate experience only for them and another couple, Charles and Bianca, the group's youngest executives. Joseph guided them among oak barrels and dusty bottles, recounting the history of the family winery while pouring special vintages. After the third glass, when conversation flowed more freely, Joseph turned to Richard and Louisa with sparkling eyes. "You know, I've observed you two these past few days," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "And I see something rare, something that reminds me of Sophia and me when we were young." Louisa felt Richard subtly stiffen beside her, his hand seeking hers under the table. "What?" she asked, curious despite the danger of the conversation. "The way you look at each other when you think no one is watching," Sophia replied, exchanging a knowing smile with her husband. "It's different from how you look at each other in public. More genuine." An awkward silence fell upon Louisa and Richard. The paradox was disturbing. The Farrells saw authenticity precisely in the moments when they weren't consciously acting. "There's something my father always said," Joseph continued, oblivious to the effect of his words. "True love isn't what we show the world. It's what happens in the spaces between words, in the silences, in the stolen glances, when we believe no one is watching." "To true love," Charles toasted, raising his glass. "May we all be blessed to find it, at least once in our lives." Glasses clinked softly, and Louisa drank without looking at Richard, feeling the wine warm her throat, along with an emotion she couldn't, or didn't want to, name. Back in the room, the air seemed electrified. Richard walked to the balcony, observing the Tuscan nightscape, while Louisa watched him, uncertain what to say or do to break the growing tension between them. They believe us, she finally said, stopping beside him on the balcony. The irony is that when we're not trying to convince them, that's when they seem most convinced. Richard turned to her, his face partially illuminated by the moon, his eyes darker and more intense than she had ever seen them. It's not ironic, he replied, his voice low and husky. It's disturbing. Why? Because it means something real is happening here. He took a step towards her, something that wasn't in the contract. Louisa should have recoiled. She should have remembered the clauses, the terms, the professional agreement. But when Richard touched her face with a delicacy that contradicted all his usual rigidity, she leaned towards him, like a plant seeking the sun. "We're breaking the rules," she whispered, her lips inches from his. "I know." His fingers intertwined in her hair. "Do you want to stop?" In response, Louisa closed the distance between them. The kiss began hesitantly, exploratorily, as if both were testing the limits of what was happening, but it soon transformed into something more urgent, years of control and restraint crumbling in seconds. Her hands found the buttons of his shirt while he guided her back into the room, away from the gaze of the Tuscan moon and stars. They fell onto the bed like teenagers, desperate and clumsy, laughing softly when he almost knocked over the bedside lamp. "Always so controlled, Mr. Miller," she teased, helping him remove his shirt. "Not with you," he replied, the confession escaping like a sigh as his lips traced a path down her neck. "You completely disarm me, Louisa." The sound of her name in his voice, stripped of formalities and barriers, sent shivers down her spine. In that moment, they were not actress and executive, they were not a business contract, they were not an elaborate charade. They were just a man and a woman discovering each other in the dark with the raw honesty that only true desire provides. Later, lying against his chest, listening to his breathing gradually calm, Louisa felt a conflicting mixture of euphoria and apprehension. She was aware that they had crossed a point of no return, that the dynamic between them had irrevocably changed. The contract, with its clauses and limitations, now seemed a distant and irrelevant document. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, tracing invisible patterns on his chest. Richard was silent for so long that she thought he had fallen asleep, but then his voice, softer than she had ever heard it, filled the darkness. "I'm thinking that no business strategy, no multi-million-pound contract ever prepared me for this." "This?" "You." He kissed the top of her head. "What you're doing to me." Louisa closed her eyes, letting his warmth envelop her, allowing herself, just for that night, to believe that what was happening was real, that it wouldn't end when they returned to London, that maybe, just maybe, the best performance of her life wasn't a performance after all. Dawn brought with it reality. When Louisa woke up, Richard was already dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed with his phone in hand, his face once again composed in his mask of professional efficiency. "Good morning," he said, too formal for someone who hours earlier had whispered her name between passionate sighs. "We have breakfast with Joseph in half an hour. He wants to discuss the final details of the contract." The contrast between the man of the night before and the executive before her was like a cold shower. Louisa sat up, pulling the sheet to cover herself, suddenly aware of her nakedness and vulnerability. "Richard, about last night." It was a lapse. He interrupted her without looking directly at her. "We were both under the influence of wine and the situation. It shouldn't have happened." Each word was like a small blade. Louisa felt her face burn with humiliation and anger. "A lapse," she repeated, her voice dangerously controlled. "Is that how you rationalize any moment of genuine humanity? As a miscalculation?" He finally looked at her, and for an instant she glimpsed again the man from the night before, vulnerable, uncertain. But the expression soon disappeared, replaced by professional efficiency. "We have a job to do, Louisa, a contract to fulfill. Let's focus on that." He stood up and walked to the door. "I'll be waiting on the terrace for breakfast." When the door closed behind him, Louisa let out the breath she didn't know she was holding. She felt foolish, used, furious, more with herself than with him. After all, what did she expect? That a week of pretense and a night of passion would transform Richard Miller, the king of emotional control, into a completely different man? With trembling hands, she picked up her phone and opened the photo gallery. There was the image of the contract she had signed, with the clause underlined in red. No emotional involvement. Immediate termination upon return. In the days that followed, Louisa and Richard maintained the charade of the loving couple with professional perfection. In public, they smiled, touched, exchanged glances that the Farrells interpreted as love. In private, they barely spoke. The nights were silent, with Richard often working late on his laptop while she pretended to sleep, each on their side, of the bed that now seemed as vast as an ocean. On the penultimate night, during a formal dinner to celebrate the signing of the multi-million-pound contract, Joseph raised a toast to the young couple who inspired us with their genuine love. Louisa smiled mechanically, feeling Richard's arm around her waist like a dead weight. Later, alone on the balcony while Richard talked with executives, Sophia approached silently. "Something happened," the Italian woman said, not a question, but an observation. Louisa didn't have the strength to deny it. "Life isn't a fairy tale, Sophia." The older woman studied her with compassionate eyes. "You know, Louisa, in 50 years with Joseph, I've learned that love is rarely the problem. It's fear that destroys possibilities. Fear? Fear of losing control, of becoming vulnerable, of discovering that perhaps the life we've built with such care isn't enough." Sophia gently squeezed Louisa's hand. "Men like Richard build empires because they're afraid to build connections." As Sophia's words echoed in her mind, Louisa watched Richard from across the room. For a moment, their gazes met, and she saw something in those blue eyes. A sadness, a longing, a regret. Before he looked away and returned to his business conversation. The next morning, they would depart back to the UK, back to reality, where they were not husband and wife, where there was no Tuscan villa or wines at sunset, where there was only a contract coming to an end and a final payment to be made. Louisa wondered if she would be able to look back and see this whole experience as just a well-executed acting job, or if, as she feared, the best performance of her life would leave scars that no applause could heal. The return to London was like waking from a dream to plunge into the cold water of reality. The flight passed in awkward silence, with Richard absorbed in work documents and Louisa lost in a book she could barely read, the words sliding senselessly before her tired eyes. At Heathrow Airport, under the gray sky of a late London afternoon, the farewell was brief and formal. Richard called his driver to take her home, while he would go directly to an emergency meeting at the construction company. "The final payment will be transferred today," he said, extending his hand for a formal shake that contrasted painfully with the intimacy they had shared days earlier. "I appreciate your dedication to the project. It was a complete success." Louisa stared at his outstretched hand, feeling a mixture of hurt and indignation welling up in her chest. She ignored the gesture and looked directly into his eyes. "A complete success," she repeated with a bitter smile. "Congratulations on your multi-million-pound contract, Mr. Miller. I hope it was worth every drop of dignity we left in Tuscany." Something twitched in Richard's jaw, but his expression remained impassive. "Louisa, we both knew the terms from the beginning. There was no room for humanity?" she interrupted, lowering her voice so the approaching driver wouldn't hear. "For real feelings? For admitting that what happened between us was more than a lapse?" He looked away, and for an instant Louisa thought she saw a flicker of genuine pain before the mask of control returned. "The car is waiting," was all he said, moving away as if each step increased not only the physical, but the emotional distance between them. Louisa watched him walk away, his tall, elegant figure in a dark suit dissolving into the airport crowd. She felt a knot in her throat, but refused to cry. Not for him. Not for something that never truly existed, except in the brief magic of Tuscany. In the car, she let the tears come silently as London slipped by the window, gray, chaotic, too real after the Italian dream. When she arrived at her small apartment in Hackney, she felt strangely displaced, as if the place no longer fully belonged to her. She checked her bank balance on her phone. The payment was already there, the exact amount, not a penny more or less. Impeccable professionalism to the end. Louisa threw the phone onto the bed and went to the bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back seemed different, thinner, with dark circles under her eyes, but also with something new in her gaze, something that spoke of both strength and sadness. "It was just a job," she told her reflection. "Like any other role. It's over. Move on." The following weeks were for reorganization. Louisa paid all her debts, sent money to her mother, and even made a small renovation to her apartment. She returned to her drama classes in the outer boroughs with renewed energy, determined to transform the emotional experience of recent times into artistic fuel. She tried not to think about Richard, but his face appeared in dreams, and occasionally she found herself looking for news about him or Miller developments. She learned from the newspapers that the contract with the Italians had been successfully finalized and that the construction company would soon begin an ambitious urban revitalization project in a historic area of London. On a rainy Sunday, about a month after returning from Italy, Louisa was leaving a pharmacy when a sudden dizziness made her lean against the wall. It wasn't the first time in recent weeks. Initially, she attributed it to stress and readjustment to routine. But now, with the pregnancy test in her bag and the symptoms becoming increasingly evident, she could no longer ignore the possibility. At home, with trembling hands, she took the test. The 2 minutes of waiting were the longest of her life. When the 2 pink lines appeared, clear and unequivocal, Louisa sat on the bathroom floor, stunned. A baby, a life. The most unexpected consequence of a night that should have been just a lapse, as Richard had so coldly defined it. It took her 3 days to process the news, to accept the reality of her situation, and to make the most difficult decision. To tell Richard. Not because she needed him. The money she had received would give her enough comfort during pregnancy, and she had always been independent, but because, despite everything, she believed in his right to know, to choose whether or not he wanted to be part of that child's life. Richard's secretary seemed confused when Louisa called asking for a meeting. "Mr. Miller is extremely busy with the new project, miss. May I know the subject?" "It's personal," Louisa replied firmly. "And urgent. Tell him it's Louisa Campbell." There was a long silence. And then, "One moment, please." When the secretary returned, her voice had a different, more formal tone. "Mr. Miller can see you tomorrow at 6 p.m. after normal business hours. Is that confirmed?" Louisa felt her heart quicken. "Yes, I'll be there." Miller Development's office seemed even more intimidating at dusk, with the lights of London beginning to dot the panoramic view through the enormous windows. Louisa was led directly to Richard's office, where he stood waiting by the window, contemplating the city he had helped build. Louisa. He turned, and she immediately noticed the changes. He looked thinner, with shadows under his normally alert eyes. "I didn't expect to see you again." She didn't sit when he indicated the chair. She preferred to stand, maintaining the physical distance that reflected the emotional abyss between them. "I didn't intend to return," she admitted, her voice calmer than she expected. "But the situation has changed." Richard frowned, confused. She realized that for the first time since she had known him, he was not in control of the situation, did not know what to expect. "I'm pregnant." The words fell into the silence of the room like stones into a lake, creating invisible ripples that seemed to change the density of the air between them. Richard visibly paled, leaning on the table as if his legs might give way. "Are you sure?" he finally asked, his voice almost unrecognizable. "Absolutely. I took the home test and confirmed with a blood test yesterday." Richard ran a hand through his hair, an unusual gesture for someone so restrained. His eyes scanned her face, dropped to her still flat stomach, and returned to meet her gaze. "Is it mine?" The question, though predictable, still managed to hurt her. "Yes, Richard. It's yours. There's been no one else since before the trip." She took a step forward, holding his gaze. "But I didn't come here to ask for anything. I just came to inform you. I'm having this baby, with or without you in the equation. The decision to participate or not is entirely yours." He blinked, visibly trying to process the information he had just received. For a moment, Louisa saw the same vulnerable man who had embraced her that night in Tuscany, lost, without his usual armor. "Louisa, we need to talk. Sit down and—" "No," she interrupted him gently. "Not now. You need time to think, to decide what you want. I'm not asking for an immediate answer." She took a piece of paper from her bag where she had written down her phone number and address. "When you're ready, if you're ready to talk for real, find me. Until then, I'll continue with my life as normal." She left the paper on the table and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Wait." Richard rounded the table, approaching but still, maintaining a respectful distance. "Are you well? Physically, I mean, and financially?" She smiled faintly. "I'm great, and the payment you made resolves any immediate financial concerns. But a baby, the costs are—" He seemed genuinely worried. "Richard," she interrupted him again, more firmly now, "I didn't come here for money. I came because I believe you have the right to know, and because, despite everything, I think this child deserves the chance to know its father, but only if you truly want to be that father." She paused, choosing her words. "I don't want a monthly check. I just want you to think carefully about what you're willing to offer emotionally, because that's all I'll accept." She turned and walked to the door, feeling his gaze follow her. When she touched the doorknob, she heard him call her name one last time. "Louisa." There was something different in his voice, an emotion she couldn't identify. "I'll think about it. I promise." She nodded without looking back and left. On the pavement, in front of the imposing building, she took a deep breath of the London night air. She felt strangely light, as if a weight had been removed from her shoulders simply by sharing the truth. The future was uncertain. Would she be a single mother? Would Richard play a role in the child's life? But for the first time in weeks, she felt she could face any challenge that came. What Louisa couldn't imagine was the devastating impact her visit would have on Richard. After she left, he remained motionless for long minutes, staring at the piece of paper with her number as if it were a strange and potentially dangerous object. A child. He would be a father. The news unleashed an avalanche of emotions in him that he had tried to keep under strict control for decades. His own father, a distant and severe man, had built Miller Developments with an iron fist, teaching him from an early age that feelings were distractions, that the only thing that mattered was ambition, success, legacy. When his ex-wife left him 3 years prior, claiming she could no longer bear to live with a man who seemed like a robot, Richard accepted the end of the marriage as he accepted any business setback, a reversal to be overcome, a statistic to be filed away. He never allowed himself to question whether the emotional coldness he had inherited from his father was truly a virtue or a curse. Until Louisa. Until that night in Tuscany, when all his carefully constructed defenses crumbled under her touch, under the way she looked at him. Not the successful businessman, not the heir to Miller Developments, just the man, with all his vulnerabilities and unconfessed desires. And now, a child. A life that would be part of him and part of her, uniting them forever, regardless of any decision they made now. The next morning, Richard didn't go to the office. For the first time in years, he called in sick, leaving his team in shock. He drove aimlessly for hours, eventually finding himself on a deserted beach on the north coast, where he walked barefoot in the sand, trying to organize thoughts that refused to follow his usual logic. Did he want to be a father? He had never seriously considered the possibility. His previous marriage had been a union of social and business conveniences, with the tacit understanding that children were not part of the agreement. But now, confronted with the imminent reality of fatherhood, he discovered a surprising desire growing within him. And Louisa? What he felt for her was more complex, deeper than anything he had experienced before. It wasn't just desire, although there was that too. Intense and undeniable. It was admiration for her strength, fascination with her emotional freedom, a connection that defied his rational understanding of the world. In the days that followed, Richard immersed himself in methodical research on pregnancy and early childhood, reading scientific articles, buying books, discreetly talking to a pediatrician friend. Typical of him, to transform even this emotional situation into a project to be studied and mastered. A week. After Louisa's visit, he finally made a decision. He didn't call, preferring to go to her apartment in person, unannounced. It was a Friday evening, and he calculated she would be home. When Louisa opened the door, wearing sweatpants and a loose t-shirt, her hair tied in a messy bun, he felt something tighten in his chest. She seemed simultaneously more fragile and stronger than he remembered. "Richard." She didn't seem surprised, as if she had somehow been expecting him. "Come in." The apartment was different, more organized, with some new plants and a freshly painted bookshelf. On the coffee table, theater scripts and an open notebook showed she was working. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," he said, looking strangely out of place in his impeccable suit in her relaxed environment. "It's fine. Do you want some tea? Or water?" "Water, please." While she went to the kitchen, Richard surveyed the apartment, noticing small details he had ignored the first time he was there, during the rehearsals for the Tuscan charade. Photographs of her in different plays, a framed drawing made by a child with the inscription, "To the best teacher in the world," books on makeshift shelves. A real home, not just a place to sleep, like his own luxury apartment in Knightsbridge. Louisa returned with the water, and they sat facing each other, she on the sofa, he in the reading armchair. "How are you feeling?" he asked, genuinely concerned. "Well, the morning sickness is worse than I expected, but nothing unbearable." She paused. "Did you think about what I said?" Straight to the point, as always. It was one of the things that most intrigued him about her. The absence of games, of manipulations, the raw honesty that contrasted with the corporate world he was immersed in. "Yes. I thought about it a lot." He placed the glass of water on the table and leaned forward. I want to be part of this child's life, Louisa. I want to be a present, participatory father, not just a name on the birth certificate or a source of financial resources. Her face softened slightly, but still held a cautious expression. That's good, Richard. But what does being a present father mean to you? Because our definitions might be very different. He nodded, acknowledging the validity of her concern. It means being involved in important decisions, attending medical appointments if you allow, participating in daily life when the child is born, helping with basic care, not just delegating to nannies or staff. He paused, searching for the right words. It means trying to be different from my own father. Better, I hope. Something in his voice when he mentioned his father made Louisa look at him more carefully, noticing layers of old pain he normally kept hidden. "And what about us?" she finally asked. "What's your proposal for us to deal with this as co-parents?" Richard took a deep breath. In recent nights, lying awake in his spacious, cold bed, he had imagined 1,000 different scenarios, developed strategies and plans as he would for any crucial negotiation. "I don't have a formal proposal," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "For the first time in my life, Louisa, I don't have a detailed plan. I just know I want to do the right thing for our child, and that since we returned from Tuscany, I can't stop thinking about you." The confession hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Louisa felt unexpected tears in her eyes, which she quickly blinked away. "Richard, we can't just... No," he interrupted her gently. "I'm not proposing we go back to what happened in Tuscany, or that we try some kind of relationship forced by the baby. I'm just saying that something changed in me. You changed something in me. And if there's any possibility of us discovering what that means, I'd like to try." It was the least romantic and, at the same time, most sincere declaration Louisa had ever heard. So characteristic of him. No flourishes, no grand promises, just the naked truth, awkward in its vulnerability. "We can start slowly," she finally said. "Medical appointments. Conversations about expectations and plans, getting to know each other better, outside of that charade we lived, and see where that leads us." The relief on his face was evident, as if he expected immediate rejection. "Thank you. It's more than I deserve after how I acted in Tuscany. I'm not doing this for you, Richard. I'm doing it for our child, and for myself, too." She lightly touched her still imperceptible belly. "I never imagined being a mother like this in these circumstances, but now that it's happening, I want to do my best." He nodded, swallowing, hard. There was more he wanted to say, confessions about how he had deliberately pushed her away after that night, not because it meant nothing, but because it meant too much. About the paralyzing fear he had felt when he realized he was losing control for the first time in his adult life. About how he had spent the last week mentally reorganizing his entire existence around the idea of this child, and perhaps more disturbing, around the possibility of having her in his life. But he said none of that. Not yet. There was time. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe there was an open future, not entirely planned, not completely under his control. "May I accompany you to the next appointment?" he asked, almost shyly. Louisa smiled, and something in her gaze reminded him of that night on the Tuscan balcony when everything seemed possible. "Of course. It's on Tuesday at 10 a.m. Can you find space in your extremely busy schedule, Mr. Miller?" The ironic use of the formal address, now almost an affectionate nickname between them, brought an involuntary smile to his face. "For both of you, I'll always have time." In the months that followed, an improbable routine began to establish itself. Richard faithfully attended every medical appointment, took meticulous notes, researched fetal development, and asked doctors more questions than Louisa herself. When they discovered it would be a boy at the fourth-month ultrasound, she saw him discreetly wipe away a tear, perhaps the most spontaneous gesture she had ever witnessed from him. Gradually, visits to discuss baby-related matters transformed into occasional dinners, into conversations that stretched late into the night, into a deeper and more honest mutual understanding than they had experienced during the Italian charade. Louisa discovered that behind the facade of the ruthless executive was a man who had grown up emotionally isolated, with a tyrannical father and a submissive mother, a boy who had learned early on that showing feelings was a sign of weakness. Richard, in turn, marveled at her resilience, at her ability to transform adversity into art, at the genuine love she dedicated to her students in the outer boroughs. On a rainy night in the 6th month of pregnancy, as they talked in her living room after a simple dinner he had brought from a nearby restaurant, the baby kicked hard. Louisa took Richard's hand and placed it on her rounded belly. "Feel that? I think he's going to be a football player." The astonishment and emotion on his face when he felt the movement under his palm were like a revelation for Louisa. In that instant she understood that, despite all the mistakes and uncertainties, she had made the right choice in allowing him to participate in this process. "It's incredible," Richard whispered, still with his hand on her belly. His eyes met Louisa's, and something silent and profound passed between them. "You're incredible." Without thinking, he leaned in and kissed her, gently, almost reverently, so different from the urgent passion of that night in Tuscany. When he pulled away, he seemed startled by his own gesture. "Sorry, I shouldn't have—" Louisa placed a finger over his lips, silencing him. "Don't apologize. Not for that. Not when it's real." When the 8th month arrived, Richard surprised Louisa with an unexpected proposal. Not of marriage. Both knew it was still too soon, that they were still learning to trust each other, but of a practical arrangement. "I bought an apartment," he said, showing photos on his phone, "in Richmond. 3 bedrooms, green space, near good schools. I thought maybe you'd consider moving there when the baby is born." Louisa's eyes widened. "You bought an apartment for me?" "For both of you," he corrected. "And it's yours. It's already in your name. It's not a gift with strings attached. It's not an attempt at control. It's just security for our son." She studied the photos, biting her lip. The apartment was beautiful, spacious, full of natural light, everything her small Hackney place was not. But, "Richard, it's a huge gesture, but I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of dependence." He nodded, already expecting that reaction. "I understand, and I respect that. There's no rush. The apartment will be there when, and if, you decide it's best for you both." The delicacy with which he accepted her hesitation, without pressure or manipulation, deeply moved Louisa. It was further evidence of Richard's gradual change, of his developing capacity to respect others' boundaries, to place others' needs above his own desires for control. When Michael was born on a rainy September dawn, Richard was by Louisa's side, holding her hand throughout labor. Seeing him hold his son in his arms for the first time, his large hands trembling slightly as he cradled the tiny bundle, was one of the most powerful images Louisa had ever witnessed. "He has your eyes," Richard whispered, marveling. "And your stubborn chin," she joked, exhausted but radiant. 2 weeks after the birth, when the reality of constant newborn care had already dispersed any romanticization of motherhood, Louisa woke in the middle of the night to find Richard, who had insisted on sleeping on the sofa to help with night feeds, cradling Michael in the living room. He was softly singing a lullaby she had never heard him sing before, gently swaying with the baby in his arms. Watching him from there, without him noticing her presence, Louisa felt something definitive click into place in her chest. This man, with all his complexities and contradictions, was trying. Truly trying. Not just to be a father, but to be a better, more complete person. 3 months later, when she finally agreed to move into the Richmond apartment, more for Michael's space than for any other reason, she told herself, she found a small velvet box in the bedside table drawer. Inside, a simple white, gold wedding band without stones or ostentation, with a date engraved inside, Michael's birthday. Alongside it, a note in Richard's meticulous handwriting. No contract, no clauses. Only if and when you are ready for us to build something real this time. Louisa closed the box, tears in her eyes, and put it back in the drawer. She wasn't ready. Not yet. There was a lot of history to build, a lot of trust to solidify, many difficult conversations ahead. But for the first time since that night in Tuscany, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the best performance of her life hadn't been a performance after all. Perhaps it had just been the first act of a much longer and truer story, a story that, like the best plays, would continue to surprise and move its protagonists with each new chapter.